Hi guys, I'm Brandy and welcome back to my channel, True Crime and Felines. Every Friday I bring you a true crime case or a mystery along with one or more of my 14 felines. I also have one on my lap. This is Ghost. You hardly ever see him, but he has the prettiest blue eyes. Mwah. Mwah. He's my favorite. Shh, don't tell them. This week's case takes place in Edinburgh, Scotland, in the 1820s, and deals with two men who found an unusual way to get rich. So let's get started. So we're in Edinburgh, Scotland in the 1820s. And at the Royal College of Surgeons, there is a Dr. Knox. And he is a teacher there, and he's an anatomist. So at the time in Scotland, lectures on anatomy classes became pretty popular. And Dr. Knox found that there was a lot of students willing to pay and come in for his anatomy lectures where he actually dissects a corpse in front of them. And this picked up a lot of popularity at the time because they were discovering new ways to cure diseases. So his classes were so successful that he had to start doing 2 lectures per day. And so he had at least 400 students coming through his doors for the 2 lectures per day. Now, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the Murder Act was in effect, okay? Appropriately named. Well, the Murder Act actually stipulated that only executed criminals, suicides, or orphans could actually be used for medical studies, so their corpses could be donated to the college. Now, around the 1820s, executions weren't as popular as they used to be, so bodies started not being as available as they were. Since the cadavers for these lectures were so hard to come by, if somebody showed up at the college with a fresh body that could be dissected, the college really wasn't asking any questions, and unethically sort of encouraged this practice by paying the person for the corpse. So as you can imagine, with a low supply of fresh corpses, the price of a corpse skyrocketed. Because of this, body snatching became very popular. No, we're not talking about the movie or the aliens. What we're talking about is people would actually go to fresh graves, dig them up, and snatch the corpse. These people were known as resurrection men, and they would professionally go around to graveyards and grab these corpses in order to sell them to colleges and medical study agencies. As you can imagine, families were not very happy when they found out that their recently deceased family member was snatched and who knows where they went. So they started posting security guards at the perimeters of the graveyard and guarding the fresh graves. Another precaution that started being really popular was creating a metal grill of metal and concrete and putting it on the freshly dug grave. These were called mort safes, and they were installed over the fresh graves to keep the resurrection men from stealing the bodies. 2 individuals, William Burke and William Hare, recognized a unique opportunity to make a little cash, and they weren't grave robbing or body snatching. So William Burke and William Hare were Irish from the province of Ulster. They had gone to Scotland in 1818 for opportunities in light of the Ireland famine. They would end up meeting around 1820 and quickly became friends. Burke would fall in love with a local prostitute named Helen McDougall, and the two got married. Around 1826, William Hare started shacking up with a widow named Margaret Laird. Margaret and her late husband owned a boarding house in the Old Town, and Hare and Margaret would continue to run that after they were married. So because Hare and Burke were friends, Hare invited Burke and his wife Helen to come stay at the boarding house and rent a room there because they really weren't doing very well with money and were actually selling clothes on the street. So the two couples lived together and got along reasonably well, and they were known for tossing back a few and boisterous behavior. So while staying in the boarding house, one of the residents that were there, he was an old soldier named Donald. He had gotten ill and he actually died in his sleep. Now, Margaret and Hare didn't really care that Donald died. What they cared about was that Donald owed back rent of £4, and they were just woeing over their loss of income. Now, Burke had heard that these anatomists at a college were paying for bodies. So he stated, why don't we just take the body up to the college, see what we can get for it, help pay for that back rent. Burke and Hare ended up stealing Donald's body from the coffin he was in. He wasn't buried yet. He was supposed to be buried the next day, but they snuck into the morgue, opened the coffin, stole Donald's body, replaced it with bags of bark, and then sealed up the coffin. So nobody was the wiser that there wasn't actually a body in the coffin, and then the coffin was buried the next day. So Burke and Hare ended up going to Edinburgh College and were asking around on, they have a fresh corpse for dissection, and would you be willing to pay for this? It was Dr. Knox at the college. There were other anatomists, but Dr. Knox is the one that they ended up connecting with, and Dr. Knox offered them £7 and 10 shillings, which in US dollars is about $9.66. Now, in today's money, that would be over $1,000. So as you can imagine, the two men were pretty proud of themselves. Not only did they get enough money for the back rent, they had enough money now to celebrate. As they were leaving the college, Knox had assistants that helped him prepare the bodies for dissection for his lectures. And one of the assistants told them, if they ever came across a fresh body, they'd love to see them again. A little over 2 months later, Hare had gone to Burke about a specific lodger in the boarding house. His name was Joseph. Now, Joseph was suffering from a fever, and Hare was afraid that seeing this man who was obviously sick running through the boarding house, it would deter others from renting rooms there. Now, they had an idea that, hey, when Joseph died, they're going to take his body up to the college. Well, Joseph didn't die like they thought he would, so they ended up taking the matter into their own hands. He and Burke decided to murder Joseph and then sell his body to Dr. Knox. And that's exactly what they did. So after selling the body to Dr. Knox for about £8, they decided that this was much more lucrative than actually getting a job. So they sat down and decided that they were just going to start murdering people and selling their body to the college, to Dr. Knox. They had some rules that they wrote down. The rules were, don't pick a person who is known to someone. Don't pick anyone strong. Pick someone who is sick or weak. Choose someone who is poor. Choose someone who is unwanted and whose absence wouldn't be noticed. So as you can imagine, they're looking for certain types of people that they could murder and no one would be the wiser. So the boarding house was their resource at the time. And the way that it would happen was that Burke would put his hands over their nose and mouth, and Hare would sit on their chest to keep them in place and to help with the suffocation process. Now, it's reported that both their wives, Maggie and Helen, knew what was going on and were just complacent in the crimes because money. Now, their standard fee of selling these corpses to Dr. Knox was about 10 pounds, and which in US dollars is $13.50. Today, that would be approximately $1,500. Now, it was stated that Burke kept most of the money, and he only would give Hare 2 pounds. Now, even though they were partners in crime, they got in many fights. Since Hare wasn't getting the majority of the money, he was surviving on the boarding house rent and the little money he was making from the corpses. So he was always dressed in drab, torn, dirty clothes. Well, one day, Hare showed up at the boarding house in very expensive new clothes. When Burke questioned him about this, Hare admitted that he went ahead and smothered someone himself without Burke, took the corpse and sold it to Dr. Knox, and kept the full 10 pounds. This angered Burke and caused tension between the two because Burke lost some income there. However, they would fight and make up, and through all this, they would keep partnering together, and they began to exhaust their sources at the boarding house. There was only so many new faces that would come there. So they started to set their sights elsewhere. So they decided to go into the several taverns that Edinburgh had to try to look for victims, following their rules, of course. They would end up charming their victims with laughs and stories and provide them with lots of alcohol until they were very drunk. Then they would invite them back to the boarding house or Burke's brother's place, who lived down the street, where they would end up smothering them. Now, the term burking would come out, and it meant murder by suffocation, in which that would leave the body pristine condition for sale. That's what burking was called, and this was derived from the Burke and Hare murders. So based on the rules that the two men had made up for this lucrative career they had now, most of their victims were transients and drifters. And everything was going swimmingly. But the more they did it, they started becoming reckless and ignoring their own rules. So the next two victims that they took actually broke their rules of be unknown or their absence wouldn't be noticed. Mary Patterson, also known as Mary Mitchell, was a famously beautiful prostitute, and many noticed she went missing. Burke and Hare had plied her with alcohol, took her back to Burke's brother's place. Burke's brother was out at the time, and they would end up smothering her. When they took the body to Dr. Knox, him and his assistants began to prepare it for dissection. One of the assistants of Dr. Knox actually recognized it to be Mary because he apparently had paid for her services a couple nights ago. Now, Knox would dismiss his assistant's claim, tell him he was wrong, and would continue to prepare her body for dissection and would dissect it earlier than planned, just to get rid of it, pretty much. The second victim was James Wilson, and he was an 18-year-old boy. He had intellectual disability, and he had a foot deformity. He was known as Daft Jamie. Now, the people of the neighborhood were really fond of Jamie because he was just a very nice boy. He would beg on the street, and they just looked after him. When Jamie went missing, a lot of people started noticing that. So again, Jamie's body was sold to Dr. Knox, and when Dr. Knox and his assistants started looking at the body to prepare for dissection, again, one of his assistants stated, "That's Daft Jamie. Daft Jamie has been missing." Dr. Knox told his assistants they were again wrong. And just to make sure that no other problems arose with this body, Dr. Knox would end up removing the head and the feet because of the foot deformity, so the body could not be recognized. Now, by this time, Burke and his wife Helen had made enough money to move out of the boarding house and get an apartment. But even though they had the apartment, they actually shared the space with a couple called the Grays, which was very common at the time to share a space. Burke was on to try to get his next victim for his next payday. And he met Margaret Doherty at the tavern, and he ended up luring her back to his apartment based under the guise that they were somehow related. Now, when he got back to his apartment, the Grays were there, and he convinced the Grays that Margaret was his relative and told the Grays to go stay at the boarding house for the night so Margaret would have a bed to sleep in. So the Grays went ahead and did that. Burke sent his wife to go get Hare, who promptly came over, and unfortunately Margaret was burked that night, and her body was stuffed in a straw mattress to attempt to hide her in Burke's room. Now, the next morning, the Grays would come back home and Burke was out. The Grays had, for some reason, gone into Burke's room and saw the body of Margaret shoved in the mattress. They immediately were shocked and were on their way to go to the police. The couple was intercepted by Helen, Burke's wife. Helen would end up offering them 10 pounds per week for their silence. Now, getting 10 pounds per week would be enough money to get any family out of poverty, so that was very generous. However, the Grays declined, and they ended up going to the police anyway. After the Grays had gone, and Helen apparently was following them, Burke and Hare had come back to the apartment to grab the body and take to Dr. Knox. So they were unaware that they had been caught. So they grabbed the body and off to the college they went. After they left the apartment, the police then arrived at the apartment, and they found that the straw in the mattress had blood on it, and they found Margaret's clothes there as well, and somehow ended up tracking the body to Dr. Knox's morgue. And some think that maybe one of Dr. Knox's assistants gave them an anonymous tip. Burke and Hare were both arrested along with their wives, Helen and Margaret. Now, the only body they actually had in this case was Margaret Doherty's, and all they had for all the other bodies was circumstantial evidence. But the problem was that even with Margaret, because she was smothered, there was no trauma to the body and there was no defense wounds or anything like that, so they couldn't really prove that these two men killed her. Now, they did believe that Burke is the one that actually murdered the people and that Hare would sit on their chest, and wives were just accomplices. So they approached Hare to make a deal. Testify against Burke and you will have complete immunity. Hare took the deal. Margaret and Helen were tried. They received a not proven verdict. This is a practice to actually acquit the individual, but not declare them innocent. So it really didn't matter to the public. They were guilty. In December of 1828, Burke went on trial for murdering Margaret Doherty, James Wilson, and Mary Patterson, or Mary Mitchell. Hare would testify that there were actually 16 murders in total. From January 1828 through October 1828, they killed 3 men, 12 women, and 1 child. The 3 murders that they had the most evidence for was enough to garner an execution if found guilty, so they just charged him with the 3 murders and not all 16. Now, at the trial, Dr. Knox was called to testify, and he claimed that Burke and Hare told him that they were buying the corpses from boarding houses of unclaimed bodies, which was still illegal at the time. But again, the college was not really asking any questions. They just needed bodies. So Dr. Knox was trying to distance himself from everything. Now, whether he really knew what was going on or not is debatable. Some people believed he knew exactly what was going on, but just turned a blind eye because he needed the cadavers so bad. I mean, why else would you remove Daft Jamie's head and feet? Regardless, Dr. Knox was found not guilty. Now, the jury ended up finding Burke guilty of the 3 murders, but it wasn't unanimous. 2 of the jurors were actually uncertain about his sole responsibility for the murders and were unhappy that the others weren't being held responsible as well. Nonetheless, William Burke was hung on January 28, 1829, at a crowded public event of over 25,000 people. Now, ironically, because Burke was an executed criminal, his body was sent to that very same Edinburgh college for dissection. Not by Dr. Knox, though, another anatomist that was there. Supposedly, a large auditorium filled up with medical students who watched the anatomist cut Burke into pieces. Burke's skeleton went to the Anatomical Museum of Edinburgh University Medical School, where students and staff can view it to this day. Additionally, a death mask and a book bound in Burke's skin lies in the Surgeons Hall Museum of that college as well. As for William Hare, he was released from prison in February 1829. The reason because he had immunity and was free to go, he actually stayed in the prison till February for his own protection. The public was out for blood. Him and Margaret actually reunited when he got out of prison, but they were chased out of town. They both escaped to England, supposedly, and whatever became of him and Margaret is unknown to this day. Some state that he ended up being a beggar on the streets of England and died in poverty, but that's probably more what people wish instead of an actual real report. So although Dr. Knox was cleared of any crimes in this whole thing, the public wanted justice. They attacked his house and they attacked the anatomy theater, and the professional community shunned him. There were very few students left for him at his school, so he left Edinburgh in 1842 to seek work as an anatomist in London. He ended up working as a pathological anatomist in Brompton Cancer Hospital and had a medical practice in Hackney until his death in 1862. So after the Burke and Hare murders, a duo of copycat killers arose named Bishop and Williams. They surfaced in London. They were grave robbers, but they stepped up to murdering, and they actually murdered a 14-year-old boy and tried to sell the body to the King's College in London. Now, this college must have had a higher ethical practice, as these 2 killers were caught, tried, found guilty, and they were hung in December of 1831. So after those crimes, Parliament agreed that the Murder Act needed to change. It was causing too much turmoil for everyone. Therefore, in August of 1832, Parliament passed the Anatomy Act, which allowed medical students and teachers to use donated, unclaimed, and executed criminals for dissection. That resulted in an increase in the supply of cadavers, so colleges no longer had to pay for corpses at this point. So both grave robbing and murders in the name of science wasn't lucrative anymore. So this is an example of how certain laws passed by a government agency that is supposed to help end up creating negative effects for its residents. The Murder Act was meant to add a certain degree of fear to criminals, because if you were executed, you didn't get burial rights, and you were going to be dissected as a medical study, which was considered to be further degrading And if you were religious, that was really bad, not receiving your last rites. What the Murder Act actually did was create a need for corpses, which made colleges and scientific agencies become somewhat unethical, offer money, and look the other way. It always comes down to money, doesn't it? What are your thoughts on this story? I'd love to hear what you think in the comments below. Please don't forget to subscribe, and we will be back next Friday with another true crime case or mystery. I'll see you later, guys.